This is Dawn Must Follow Night by Hunter Danson. Part 1, Chapter 33. Read by the author. The High Justice admired Amala's weapon of choice. If there was ever a piece of steel to match his axe, this was it. It stood against a flagpole at the center of the late Captain Dourif's tent, long blade gleaming in the firelight. Longer than a longsword, the hilt came up to his chest. 2 spikes protruded 6 inches from the top of the crossguard. Parrying hooks served as protection for the user's hand, and a simple but well-made wooden grip covered the foot-long distance from crossguard to pommel. The High Justice smiled at his own reflection in the wide blade. "I made it myself," Amala spoke from behind him. Even out of her plate, the blade struck an imposing figure. Broad-shouldered and nearly as tall as Lothan, there was no doubt she was more than a match for any knight, woman or no. Her face was expressionless. Working with metal was one of the first things I learned to do after the cataclysm. Amala stared into the fire, flames dancing across her black eyes. No saber for me. "What is it the black does to you blades, anyway?" Lothan asked. Amala's vacant stare focused on the justice. She frowned. "Many things, headsman, but mostly it takes." "Takes?" Amala sighed as if it should be obvious. "Thoughts, feelings, blood. It is hungry, and it feeds on us from the inside." "Then why go into the chamber in the first place?" Lothan didn't really care. He was just curious. Amala raised an eyebrow at him. "You don't believe in the convergences, do you?" Lothan shrugged. He had never thought about it before. He didn't think about much beyond the next kill. Amala frowned. The world forgets catastrophes so easily. She got up from her chair and faced the canvas of the tent. "When you fetch the prelate, I want to make clear that he is to come alone and unarmed. If he refuses these conditions, then we will withdraw and assault the castle immediately. Understand?" Lothan nodded. "You are dismissed, executioner. I will send bone for you when it is time." The High Justice cast a jealous glance over his shoulder at the greatsword before he left, then stepped out into the rain. He looked down with disgust at his boots sinking into the mud. "I hate this worse than horses," he decided, plodding toward his tent 1 sticky step at a time. "Horses do not try to eat your boots." He thought about that for a moment and recalled a particularly troublesome nag he had been forced to care for as an apprentice. "Not most horses, at least." Lothan flung the canvas door of his tent open and shuffled inside. In contrast to the pavilion now occupied by Amala, the High Justice's tent was anything but high. He stooped to avoid the ceiling and took a seat next to his axe. He looked at the blade and felt guilty for even considering the sword. This was a true beauty. Lothan smiled fondly at the polished steel and reveled in the memory of his most recent sentencing. He picked up a whetstone and let his surroundings fall away. The sound of the rain receded in the wake of the quiet scraping of stone on steel. There was Albert's neck stretched out before him on the block. He was in the courtyard, the sun warming his back as he raised his blade to the sky, and... "Justice!" Bone the messenger broke in on Lothan's reverie. "The prelate wishes you to fetch the youth stammered when Lothan's glare found him. The blade." The executioner brushed past him and began the trek towards the castle. While the distance was short, the boot-eating mud made the trek much longer than anticipated. Lothan was forced to stop no less than 3 times. By the time he reached the guards watching the main gate, he was out of curses. Anything unusual?" he shouted at the sergeant. The Dindran shook his head. "Nothing. Though in this it's hard to see much of anything." Lothan spat out a mouthful of rainwater. "We'll be just outside the gate. Signal us if anything goes amiss." Lothan's lip pulled to the right in a scowl. Was this what accepting Lindrel's offer meant? Putting himself in mud and danger and running errands. He understood that he was a neutral party, but something about the whole affair left a bad taste in his mouth. Considering he enjoyed killing people for a living, Lothan was very puzzled by this development in his psyche. He turned his back on the guard and stepped through the ruined gate of Dawn Castle. The first thing that caught his eye were the dark figures on the battlements. "They are as still as stone," he thought. "Blade!" he called. No movement and no answer. "Blade!" He tried again. Still, the figures on the battlements made no move. He looked back at the sergeant, who shrugged. A creak came from the inner yard. Lothan jumped back and watched the gates swing outwards to reveal the outline of the blade. "You must be unarmed," he called. The hooded prelate began to make his way forwards. The executioner heard the scrape of swords being drawn from scabbards behind him. Lothan motioned for the knights to hold off. "Hurry, Blade. I would rather get out of the rain sooner." The hooded man nodded, but moved no faster. Lothan watched him plod forward at a painfully slow pace and squinted at his face. "By the black!" he cursed and trudged forward, grabbing the man's arm and throwing back the hood. "Greetings, Justice," the old librarian said. The prelate sends his apologies.